You can listen to the Canadian Gothic early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
So at this point, the public's still being told to stay in place and lock their doors. RCMP responded to calls of shots fired. This was at Tumbler Ridge Secondary School.
Let me just read again. Part of this statement from the district of Tumbler Ridge says its community has experienced a deeply distressing incident. We know this will be difficult for many to process. Please check in on one another and know that Tumbler Ridge is a strong and caring community. We will get through this.
You are listening to Canadian Gothic.
I think anyone who follows the Canadian or even the international news probably knows by now. Something horrible happened in a small town in British Columbia just last week. But before we get into the story, I want to start here with a bit of context. People often view the school shooter phenomenon as a uniquely American tragedy. And yes, statistics do show that the overwhelming majority of these events happen in the US. Since the year 2000, the United States has suffered through over 600 events of gun violence on school grounds. In that same period of time, Canada had less than 30. Tragic events at American schools like Uvalde, Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, and Columbine come front of mind and demonstrate the horror found in these all too common stories. But the sad reality is, this does happen here in Canada too. And just last week, our country was dealt a very painful reminder of that. On the afternoon of February 10th, 2026, the second deadliest school shooting in Canada's modern history took place when 18-year-old Jesse Van Rootselaar entered the Tumbler Ridge Secondary School, seemingly with the goal of killing anyone and everyone unfortunate enough to cross their path.
This suspect was, for lack of a better term, hunting. They were prepared and engaging anybody and everybody they could come in contact with.
This episode of the Canadian Gothic is being produced just days after the horrific events in Tumbler Ridge. And as a result, there's still a lot we don't know about what happened, about how it happened, and definitely not about why it happened. But important questions about tragic events like this take time. So what we're going to do here tonight is collect everything we know and in the process, better position Canadian Gothic listeners to join the discussions around those important questions, the hows and the whys. So let's get into it. Tonight, in this episode of the Canadian Gothic, our topic is the 2026 Tumbler Ridge shooting.
On February 10th at approximately 1:20 p.m., RCMP received a report of an active shooter at Tumbler Ridge Secondary School. The suspect has been identified as 18-year-old Jesse Van Rootselaar, who is a resident of Tumbler Ridge.
Much like the setting of many national tragedies, few of us have heard of Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia before February 10th. So let's start there. Tumbler Ridge is a remote mining town with just under 2,500 residents that sits surrounded by mountains and forest in northeastern British Columbia. By Canadian standards, Tumbler Ridge is a relatively young town. It started as a planned community created in the early 1980s as part of a massive government-backed coal mining development. Entire highways, power lines, rail connections, and neighborhoods were built almost at once, and done so with the goal of becoming one big neighborhood where someone in the coal industry could find work, buy a house, and raise a family. Alongside the rise and fall of global coal prices, the population of Tumbler Ridge grew in the early 80s and 90s before mine closures and layoffs caused many residents to leave. Over time, the community worked to reinvent itself and its main industry shifted into forestry, tourism, wind power, and even paleontology after dinosaur tracks were discovered near the town. Today, Tumbler Ridge remains a small town that firmly grasps those characteristics that make small town life special. Life there moves at a different pace, residents know each other, and each generation of kids grow up together. The only elementary school in the town, Tumbler Ridge Elementary, currently has about 150 students enrolled, and it covers grade primary up to 6. And then, when the kids age out, they move to the community's only other school, Tumbler Ridge Secondary School, which serves grades 7 through 12. The current enrollment is just about 190. I'm sure most of us listening attended schools that double, triple, if not quadruple those numbers. So it may be hard to relate, but in a community this size, the school serves as much more than a building. It brings the entire community together each and every day. Its evening events are community events. Its fields are shared gathering spaces that everyone is a part of. And perhaps it's that central hub of community that makes what happened on February 10th almost impossible to comprehend. So let's start getting into that. I'm going to follow the story initially from the point of view of the first responders. And as I said in the beginning, there's many connecting parts of this story that are still unknown. So when the story brings us to one such unknown, I'll be clear about it rather than using creative license to connect event A to event B and so on. So as far as we know, here's how it happens. At 2:20 p.m. on Tuesday, February 10th, a 911 call is made from the Tumbler Ridge Secondary School. The caller describes an active shooter within the building. Only 2 minutes later, Tumbler Ridge's only 2 on-duty RCMP officers arrived at the scene. They arrived to a horrific one. As they approach the building, the school's fire alarms are blaring, but over the alarms, they can hear the sound of gunfire coming from within the school. Someone shouts to the arriving officers from a classroom window, letting them know that the active shooter is on the second floor of the building. But unlike Uvalde, where police waited over an hour before confronting the shooter, these cops in Tumbler Ridge literally ran into harm's way. Perhaps it's because they were members of this small community and, as a result of that, knew the majority of the kids whose lives were at risk. And they didn't hesitate. As they entered the school, shots continued to echo through the halls. Following that warning they received from the classroom window, these 2 officers made their way up a stairwell into the second floor. And that's when they encountered their first victim. We don't know who it was exactly, but it most likely was a child, and almost definitely one they knew personally. But in the moment, the 2 officers wouldn't have had time to do anything more than check a pulse, if even that. And as they entered the second floor hallway, they became the target. It's not been said yet what, if any, communication they may have had with the shooter, but it has been said they were taking shots from the direction of the school's library and that these cops didn't fire back. Now, as this is happening, the high school, as well as the nearby elementary school, are both in a lockdown state, where children and teachers are barricading themselves into the classrooms. But the library clearly had been breached. At this same time, outside of the school, police communications teams were planning to notify residents of Tumbler Ridge with an emergency alert, which is a disruptive message sent to cell phones, radio, and TV broadcasts in the area. The message, which was being written and was about to be sent, read this: "Active shooter alert. Those in Tumbler Ridge area are asked to stay inside, shelter in place, lock your doors, and refrain from leaving your home or business. The suspect is described as a female in a dress with brown hair." Now, as the communications people are going through the necessary process to get that message out, let's get back to the upstairs hallway. As those officers, whose backup still hadn't arrived, continued towards the library, they heard one loud last burst from a firearm, and then the sound of someone collapsing. As they entered the library, they found the suspect dead on the ground with 2 long guns lying next to them. Within the library was a scene nearly unimaginable. A 39-year-old educational assistant and 5 children, none of which over 13 years old, were killed in there, and 2 children were clinging to life, one of which, 12-year-old Maya Gabala, was shot several times after trying to save her friends.
She tried to lock the door of the library from the shooter to save the other kids. And she tried to lock it and then ran under a table, and he shot her.
As police began clearing the school and planning for the possibility that there was more than one shooter involved, another 911 call would be received that would both expand and deepen the tragedy that was unfolding. At 2:47 local time, just 25 minutes after the shooting at the school began, a call would come in from a resident of a home just a short walk from the school. This resident informed the 911 operator that she heard her neighbor and a child outside another neighbor's home, and they appeared distraught. Sensing that something was wrong, the caller and the adult neighbor entered the home and found a trail of spent shotgun shells leading to an upstairs living room. When she reached the top of the stairs, she found 39-year-old Jennifer Jacobs lying on the couch with a blanket draped over her, and nearby was her 11-year-old son, Emmett Jacobs. Both of them were dead. The caller then rushed outside, put her arm around the young child, and called 911. The kid told her that all they wanted was to forget the sight of their brother and mom with the bullet holes in them. This second crime scene was at 112 Fellers Avenue, And clearly, whatever happened at the school started there. And wasn't a surprise to police. It was an address they knew well. This family's 18-year-old child has been a regular source of concern for years.
We have a history of police attendance at the family residence. Some of those calls were related to mental health issues.
At this point, we have the main movements of the Tumbler Ridge shooting covered. There's 2 crime scenes. The first is a private home. It's the shooter's home. Inside, police found their 39-year-old mother, Jennifer Jacobs, dead, as well as her 11-year-old son, the shooter's half-brother, 11-year-old Emmett, who were both killed with a shotgun that responding police found in the home. And then at the school, there were 7 dead. 12-year-old Kylie Smith, 12-year-old Zoe Benoit, 12-year-old Tiki Lampert, 12-year-old Abel Wansa Jr., 13-year-old Ezekiel Schofield, 39-year-old educational assistant Shonda Avagunia Durand, and the shooter, 18-year-old Jesse Van Rootselaar. In addition to the 9 deaths, there were approximately 25 people being treated for injuries at the school, 2 of which were in critical condition. One was Maya that we heard about earlier, who was shot several times after trying to lock the door to the library.
12-year-old Maya Gabala, now at BC Children's Hospital in a medically induced coma.
Now at this point, let's take a short break, and when we get back, we're going to learn about the shooter's background, their access to weapons, and the horrible way social media has been handling this tragedy. After many tragedies, Tumbler Ridge included, the public attention turns towards finding blame. And in this story, on its surface, it seems like it would be easy. You have a lone shooter who killed their mother and half-brother, and then a collection of innocent people at a nearby school. But as anyone with a head on their shoulders knows, nothing about tragedy is simple. So let's start by zooming in on what we know about the shooter's life and their family. Jesse Van Rootselaar was 18 years old and was living in Tumbler Ridge at the time of the attack. If you came across any articles about this case online and you had the bravery to enter the comments section, you probably know that Jesse was born male, but for several years now has identified as female, which brings us back to that emergency alert that I read to you earlier, describing the shooter as a female. The police haven't yet said if that description was simply the result of someone visually identifying the shooter, or if they knew from the start that Jesse was the person responsible. But regardless, Jesse's gender identity and expression, at least in the eyes of many, is to me a gigantic, controversial red herring in this whole story. I've seen countless posts and comments, some with views in the millions, sharing obviously faked data that supports a plague of trans mass shooters. But it's worse than that. I've seen countless posts and comments, including anti-trans language, that almost come off as celebratory at the fact that the shooter's gender identity differed from their biological sex. Now, another dark aspect of this story and on this topic is that in the early race to find information on the shooter, someone happened upon a Facebook profile with a similar name to Jesse's that appeared to be of a trans woman. This person, who lives in Ontario and doesn't appear to have been 18 years old any time in the last 10 years or so, had their photos and personal information smeared across the internet in posts naming them as the Tumbler Ridge mass killer. It seemed to start with random right-leaning blogger types, usually incorporating anti-trans statements. But it spread so fast that their photos went mainstream. Even CBC Radio Canada shared this innocent person's photos, identifying them as the shooter. If you search Tumbler Ridge Shooter on any social media site, you're probably still going to find their photos. The RCMP tried to get in front of this by doing what to me seems like an unprecedented thing. They released an official photo of the shooter and accompanied it with an apology to that Ontario resident who got wrapped up in this. Now, I don't want to spend too much more time on this point, as I think when we get into Jesse's life, it's going to be clear that their gender is not the big issue to be addressed. The last thing I'm going to say on this is that my thoughts seem to mirror that of the RCMP's. In this clip from a press conference held the morning after the shooting, you'll hear RCMP Deputy Commissioner Dwayne McDonald answer what I think comes across as a bad faith question on that matter.
We've heard all around the world reports coming out from different media, not local but world, and we've heard people from Tumbler Ridge, actually people that know the shooter, and they are all saying that this person is transgender. Why is the RCMP not speaking to this? Why are we hiding this from the public?
Well, first off, thank you for your question. We're not hiding it. In fact, you're the first media to ask the question. I will say this. We identified the suspect as they chose to be identified in public and in social media. I can say that Jesse was born as a biological male who approximately, the information that I have, approximately 6 years ago began to transition to female and identified as female both socially and publicly.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've heard a lot of transgender and masculine shootings. Do you think there's a correlation here?
It's too early to say whether that has any correlation in this investigation. I think it's important to recognize that this investigation is still in its infancy. We have scenes still lock down the school and the residence while we execute search warrants and gather further evidence and talk to witnesses that may have further evidence for police.
Thank you for taking it.
And with all that addressed, let's move on. The next thing I think we need to know about is that Jesse had a well-documented history of mental illness, and it wasn't some kind of closely guarded family secret. Jesse had dropped out of school about 4 years ago. Their mental health was a large part of that. They had many instances that led to police intervention, and they were apprehended for assessment multiple times. One story that stands out was shared by a neighbor of Jesse's family. They recounted a 2023 event in which Jesse lit their own house on fire, allegedly in an attempt to kill the family. The home was nearly fully engulfed when firefighters arrived, and Jesse was simply sitting outside the home. We don't know much about what happened, and the RCMP have yet to address this, but most of the neighborhood witnessed it, and Jesse themselves discussed it online. In a message board discussing psychedelic drugs, Jesse made a post where they described experimenting with magic mushrooms, and to quote Jesse, "going crazy and burning my house down." Jesse also explained they recently got out of the psych ward as a result. And there's another interesting piece of info that can be gleaned from this post, as Jesse outlined the basics of their mental health diagnosis. In the message, they state, and I quote, "I'm not schizophrenic, I'm unlikely to be bipolar, but I've been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, major depressive disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder." Now, much of Jesse's online footprint has been deleted at this point, but we can still see some things. In a Facebook post Jesse's mom made, she plugged his YouTube channel, which she described as being about gaming, firearms, and hunting. And on the topic of gaming, the gaming platform Roblox issued a statement after the shootings where they explained they disabled an account belonging to Jesse and removed all content associated with that account. One piece of the content was a game Jesse designed that involved running around a mall shooting people. So it's fair to say that violence was mixed up in these mental health problems. Here's how the RCMP addressed questions related to Jesse's mental health.
So a suspect is identified as an 18-year-old female by the name of Jesse. We have a history of police attendance at the family residence dealing with concerns of mental health with respect to our suspect. I can say that on different occasions the suspect was apprehended for assessment and follow-up.
So apprehended under the Mental Health Act?
Yes.
Taken to hospital?
In some circumstances, yes.
So Jesse was an 18-year-old with well-documented mental health troubles. So now let's move on to exactly who was caring for Jesse during this time. Jesse shared his home with 4 younger siblings, and together, the 5 of them were being cared for by a single mother. Her legal name is Jennifer Jacobs, but she went by Jennifer Strang. In a strange twist, a lot of what we know about Jennifer comes from the mother of one of Jesse's victims. Earlier, we heard about Maya Gabala, the 12-year-old girl who tried to lock Jesse out of the library and was clinging to life in a hospital after being shot several times. Turns out that Maya's mother knows the family well. In fact, she babysat Jesse as a child. In a recent interview with CBC, she described Jennifer as a devoted parent doing everything she could while raising her family in a remote community with limited mental health services. She said Jesse's mother had spent several years trying to get help for Jesse and had been open about her concerns about a lack of resources and care before the tragedy. Additionally, Jesse's grandparents released a statement echoing the now deceased Jennifer's concerns about access to mental health resources. I'll read a little bit of the statement from Adele and Russell Strang. "Jesse did the unimaginable, and our family is devastated beyond words. We've lost our beloved daughter and 2 grandchildren. So many others are grieving unimaginable losses, and our hearts are with every family whose lives have been shattered by this tragedy. And then they go on to describe Jennifer's attempt to seek help. I quote, "There were canceled appointments, gaps in care, and even electroconvulsive therapy. We trusted that the system in place would provide the sustainable support Jesse needed. And from our perspective, the system failed us." Now, having covered stories such as this far too many times to list, the people in major cities have issues accessing mental health resources. What type of services would exist in a community like Tumbler Ridge? I can only imagine. It's pretty bare bones. But the steps Jesse's mom took to find care, something we don't know at this point. But I do expect the story of Jesse's mental health history to be told in more detail in the future. But for now, that's about all we know, so let's move on. I want to get into the family a bit more and tackle some of the last names at play here. Let's start with Jesse's mom, Jennifer. Her maiden name is Strang, and she went by Strang and used Strang on social media, but her legal name was Jennifer Jacobs, which she had from a prior relationship. Jesse went by Jesse Strang, and that's the name people in the community knew them by, but their legal name was Jesse Van Rootselaar, which came from their biological father, who was never really a part of Jesse's life, and according to a statement that father shared publicly, that was not his choice. In fact, court records show that Jesse's dad appealed to the courts both for better access to his child and to prevent Jesse's mom from leaving the province with Jesse. The courts agreed, and in their ruling described the Strang children as having lived an almost nomadic life, moving between Western Canada and other parts of the country. So you probably can tell we have a pretty precarious situation emerging here. But it gets worse, at least in my mind. This was a home with firearms. Just a quick glance at Jesse's mom's Facebook account will show an open firearms case with several long-barreled rifles or shotguns inside. The caption she added mentions an interest in going for target practice. So that post alone makes me assume she was into firearms. But scrolling back a little further in her Facebook account, I see that she shared posts that oppose furthering of gun control in Canada. So this crime seems to have happened in a home with firearms, in one that to some extent embraced firearms culture. And much like the mental health problems, the firearms in the house were something the RCMP had dealt with in the past. Here is how the firearms in the home were discussed in the RCMP's press conference we've been joining in on.
I will say that, again, I'm not trying to be too circumspect, but police have attended that residence in the past, approximately a couple of years ago, where firearms were seized under the criminal code. I can say that at a later point in time, the lawful owner of those firearms petitioned for those firearms to be returned, and they were.
Were criminal charges laid in relation to those firearms?
No.
Now, reading between the lines of what we just heard there, at some point, firearms were taken from the home during a criminal investigation. It could have been the house fire, could have been something else. But whatever led to it, the owner of the guns appealed to the courts to have them returned, and they were successful. But further to that, what we know now is that none of the firearms previously seized were used during the Tumbler Ridge shooting. What we know about those firearms is that an unregistered shotgun was used to kill Jesse's mom and half-brother Emmett, and that gun was left in the home and found by RCMP when they arrived. Then at the school, Jesse had brought two firearms, a long gun and a modified rifle. Police say it was the modified rifle that did the majority of the damage in the school and that it had an unknown origin. Jesse did have a firearms license, but it expired in 2024, and Jesse had no weapons registered to them at the time of this event. So one mystery, at least that the public is left with at this point, is where did Jesse get these weapons? Were they legal? Is someone culpable in some way for supplying them with the weapons or the ammunition? Now, these questions, of course, will be a central focus of the investigation going forward. So at this point, I think the majority of the story and the moving parts are behind us, but clearly there's so much more to understand and so much grieving to take place. Information is coming out on this story almost hourly. In fact, the police just began to release some details of what happened in the school. Specifically, they announced that Jesse didn't seem to be targeting anyone in particular, Jesse wasn't taunting or speaking to people, and that the vast majority of what happened was caught on video via the school's surveillance system. But like I said at the beginning, no tragedy is simple. Things we're going to want to know is what was happening in Jesse's life. What was happening in Jesse's life in the days prior to this? Why did Jesse choose the school? How did Jesse get into the school? Which type of online connections did Jesse have? And I say that as a school shooting in a library is very reminiscent of Columbine. There's a lot to learn here. The shooter's gender identity, to me, is a massive distraction in terms of the public discourse. If all is as it seems, access to mental health services, the strengths and authority related to those services, and access to firearms seem like the most appropriate places to start. Now, with that said, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode at this point. But as this is a case that I'm following closely, I intend to further explore this story in the future. If anyone connected to this case or to Tumbler Ridge in any way cares to speak with me, I invite you to reach out via my website, thecanadiangothic.com. Now, I want to end here by expressing my deepest condolences to the families of the Tumbler Ridge victims. I want to send my wishes of a speedy recovery to the survivors. And I want to send my and all the listeners' positive thoughts to the entire Tumbler Ridge community.
People embracing, comforting each other in their collective show of grief. Dozens gathering in Langley to honor those killed and injured in one of the worst mass killings in the country's history. 12-year-old Zoe Benoit is from Langley. Those who knew her say the family moved to Tumbler Ridge about 3 years ago.
I just absolutely adored Zoe. She was so sweet and just a ball of light. Just a warm-hearted soul and just so kind to everybody.
Because this child, whenever the mother.
And halfway across the world in Zambia, this emotional tribute to honor 12-year-old Abel Mwansa, described as a little angel. Also killed in the school, Ezekiel Schofield, loved by friends and classmates, remembering Kylie Smith as a kind soul, Takaria Lampert, described as a loving, courageous child, and educator Shanda Avugana Duran.
Her husband told me she loved nothing more than her students.
At Friday night's vigil, the town square was filled with mourners and stories of heroism. One particular classroom was highlighted.
Mr. Dealey heard shots, and he recognized them right away.
The premier said there was a dilemma. Dealey's own son had left to use the washroom.
And he made the decision to lock and block the door with his son outside the classroom to keep the children safe in his science class, the children that he had promised parents he would do everything to protect.
Luckily, his son was safe. In response to the attention from the premier, the science teacher sharing on social media, "I never felt alone," barricading doors, keeping kids calm, distracting them, and making them feel loved. These are the actions that my colleague took and the actions I knew that they were taking as soon as it started. Before the school shooting, 18-year-old Jesse Van Rootselaar is accused of killing her mother, Jennifer Jacobs, and stepbrother, Emmett Jacobs, inside the family home. In Toronto, dozens attending this vigil to honor the victims and as a show of solidarity.
Even though they're this tiny, isolated little town, the whole country of Canada is aware of what's happened to them and sending them tons of love.
In Tumbler Ridge, the yellow tape that's been surrounding the secondary school now removed. But the superintendent says the expectation is students and staff will not be returning to the current school site.
I want to thank you for joining us for this episode of the Canadian Gothic. As we part, I want to end with thanks to the contributors to this episode. First, a big thanks to all the reporters on the ground in Tumbler Ridge who are bringing us these very difficult updates. A big thanks to Monty, Datta, who contributes the music for this show, and Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast, who provides our intro and outro voiceovers. And then lastly, but most importantly, a massive thank you goes out to each and every one of you listening, as without your interest and your support, the Canadian Gothic would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, I want to thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed. Jim, Terry, and Adam, we appreciate you. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple bucks a month, and that money will fund the creation of new episodes. But the premium feed will also give you those new episodes 2 days early, get them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can go premium at thecanadiangothic.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by sharing this episode on social media and letting all your like-minded friends know they should listen. Your support is very much appreciated. And with all that said, until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
Thank you for listening to Canadian Gothic.
Well, Premier David Eby of BC met with Prime Minister Carney and the other leaders prior to the vigil last night to speak to survivors of the shooting. And David Eby made some news last night when he, from the podium, made a promise to those students at Tumbler Ridge Secondary School.
And I want to promise something to the high school students who are here. I am sure you are anxious about having to go back to that school, and I will promise you that not one of you will ever be forced to go back to that school. We will provide a safe place for you to go to school.
The details are still to be worked out, but according to the local MLA, Larry Neufeld, it will likely involve bringing in portables at a different location. Again, details still to be worked out, but those students are being told they will not have to go back to Tumbler Ridge Secondary.